Today is Tuesday, September 13th, 2022. This is Stephen Fagan, the curator of the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, and this interview is part of our oral history project. And sir, at the start, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves. If I could just get your name, date and place of birth, and a little background to get us started.
I'm Alan Elliott. I was born here in Dallas, July 10th, 1952. And I attended Dallas schools my entire life, and I've lived here all my life except for a few years in Georgia.
Excellent. Since you are a native, tell me a little bit about growing up in Dallas. What was the city like back in the mid to late 50s?
Well, I grew up in the Oak Cliff area of Dallas, and it was, it was just, you see pictures of the sort of the ideal. Of course, back then, in the area I lived in, it was all new housing and stuff, new neighborhoods, kids running around every place, and so it was a very great place to live. Lots of kids, lots of things to do. We all walked to school, so it was a nice place to grow up.
Did you go to the Texas Theater on Jefferson?
Oh yeah. Once I got to, now we wouldn't let our kids do this, but once I got to be 10 or 11 years old, or maybe 12 or something like that, I would take the bus to Jefferson, the corner of Jefferson and Marsalis, and I would walk one end, which would pass the Texas Theater, so I went to many movies there, all the way up to, to Hampton and back, or maybe Polk Street in back. So, that was my Saturday afternoon, looking at the coin shops and the other kinds of things, and of course there was always something interesting at the Texas Theater. And also, right across the street was the Top 10 Records, and you may know that they have in there the telephone, and I hope I'm not going to get the story exactly right, but somehow it was used by the police to call in information about the assassination. So that phone is still there today.
Yeah, it plays into a conspiracy theory.
Right.
It's a part of the lore.
Right. And there's a lot of it, yeah.
Would you come downtown very often to go to Teich's or places like that?
When in that era, when we came downtown, of course there were no malls really until later. So in that era, we all got dressed up. Mom and Dad got dressed up, and we went downtown. Certainly to Sanger Harris. I remember the Sanger Harris had this big opening in a wind wall that you walked through to get into the store. So we went to Sanger's, we went to Teich's. We hardly ever went to Neiman's, but we went to the main stores downtown.
I bet you remember.
And Woolworth.
Oh yeah, I bet you remember those window displays at Neiman's for Christmas.
Yes, we did. We did see them. In fact, even today, occasionally we go in. They still have great ones. So even today, we still go look at those.
What would you say is your earliest childhood memory of John F. Kennedy?
Well, of course, I remember the 1960 campaign a little bit. We talked about it in school. I remember we even had a vote in school. I think Nixon won by one vote, but so we talked about it while we were in school and followed. We followed a little bit of what was going on, not a lot, because that would have been like the third, fourth grade that I was in at that time. But we are aware of that, and certainly when President Kennedy came to town, our entire school went to the what was in the auditorium, and they had 2 or 3 black and white TVs set up there, and we all watched him arrive. So it was broadcast live. So we watched him arrive that morning, and we had a discussion of who he was, and a little bit about the background and all that. So we were all aware that he was in town and that he was visiting Dallas that day.
That is such a unique memory. I've talked to so many people, local and all over the country, and very few kids in school got to see that Love Field arrival, which was live on Channel 8, and they had pool coverage, so all the networks could tune in. Fascinating. Were your parents Kennedy supporters?
I don't even remember back then. It's hard for me to recall. They weren't total. I know they voted and stuff, but we didn't discuss political stuff very much. I remember a little bit about my dad sort of moving from Republican to Democrat to Republican a little bit. He was a postal worker, and so he was very aware of particularly the representative that was represented our group, was he going to support postal issues and stuff? So I think it was mostly an issue kind of thing more than a party.
Before we get to the day of the assassination, just a couple of things from the era that I like to touch on. As a kid in school, did you do duck and cover drills, talk about the threat of communism?
I was talking about that to some friends yesterday. We had the nuclear bomb drills, duck and cover, as well as the tornado drills, but the duck and cover ones are the ones that you sort of remember hiding under your desk. And as we mentioned, I think we even knew back then that wasn't going to protect us from a nuclear bomb. But of course, we remember that. And, there was a little bit of scaredness involved there, but not too much. It was just, we did one like every month or something, we would do it. I do remember Sputnik. I remember when that went up, and that was sort of a scary thing. I remember sitting out at night on the hood of our car, me and other people and our other kids, and we were trying to find it. I think maybe somewhere in the paper it said, it's 7:03, watch it, and you could see it, and we thought we saw it. So I don't know if we really did or not, but it was a big deal back then. So yeah, we were all aware of the issues, that kind of issue at least, the threat that was real or perceived, whatever it was back in that era.
Did you ever talk to your parents about what would we do, where would we go in case the bombs went off? No,
we never had that conversation. But I always thought, we ought to have someplace we should go. We ought to have someplace outside of Dallas. Everybody should meet in Midlothian or something. Of course, that probably wouldn't be far enough. But no, frankly, I don't remember us having that conversation at all.
In the era that you grew up, there was still segregation in Dallas. What do you remember about that?
Well, I grew up in Oak Cliff, which was all basically Caucasian, all white at that time. And around in the early 60s, we had African American people start moving in. And we had, some move in our neighborhood. And as a result of that, a lot of people did move out. We stayed for quite a long time. And, had friends and stuff like that. We eventually, in fact, I tell people, we sort of lived in South Oak Cliff at the time. And I tell people, while everybody was doing white flight, we were moving in. So we moved from South Oak Cliff close to the zoo and then on 5th Street. So we stayed in Oak Cliff during that era. But there was a change of how Oak Cliff looked at that time. And our schools became slightly segregated by the time I finished high school.
Desegregated?
Desegregated.
Right. Did you ever witness any sit-ins, protests, things like that?
I never did. Again, I don't know whether we just lived in a bubble, idyllic bubble, or something. But even though we were going through, desegregation and stuff like that, I remember we went to Adamson High School. Now, my memory may be wrong, but we had I had some black kids in my classrooms, and some of them became friends, and we knew them. So we didn't, and I'm not saying that didn't happen, but I was not aware of it at that time because I didn't see it firsthand.
Dallas certainly didn't have the kind of explosive issues that Selma and
right.
places in Mississippi had. But segregation was still present and eventually, went away. Let's go back to November 22nd. You mentioned going to the auditorium, seeing the arrival at Love Field, exciting to have the president
right.
in town. What happens next? How did you find
Well, we were going on with our day just as usual. Sort of an interesting thing is, somehow, I don't know if I went to the restroom or something, but I was out in the hall, and as I was coming back to the class, there were two teachers talking, and I heard one of them say, "The president's been shot," and they were sort of tearing up and everything, and I was like, "Wow, that's big. That's and I didn't know what to do about it. So I went back to my class, and I sort of sat there, not knowing whether to tell anyone or anything. It was just like, what's going on here? And I could hear sort of whispers out in the hall of teachers and stuff. And our teacher went out for a minute, came back in, and she looked a little bit upset. She had us start working on something. And maybe 5-10 minutes later, I don't know how much it was, but there was an announcement on the intercom, the president has been shot and we need to, and I don't remember exactly what happened after that, but it certainly was an upheaval. I remember a lot of the teachers crying, and a lot of the kids were very upset. And I don't remember if we let out early that day or not, but the rest of the day was very quiet. And of course, we all went home, and it was just obviously put a pall over the entire day. And then when we got home, of course, we were all watching television, seeing what was happening and everything. And actually, at that time, we didn't know he had died. We knew he had been shot. And I don't remember if they told us he had died before we left school or not. But anyway, I remember watching the clip of Walter Cronkite announcing his death. I mean, it was a repeat of it. We weren't there live to see that, but I remember seeing that many times. And just the things that happened in the next few days. Of course, as a kid, I remember things like the comics were not in the newspaper for maybe a week or two. And I remember the day they were all in there, and we spent all Sunday reading comics and stuff. But so there was it was a huge deal, obviously, and we knew it was a huge deal, and so that's what I remember about that day. Now, I had friends a little bit older than I was that were actually downtown. They didn't actually see the assassination, but I had one who was a little further up on, was at Elm Street, and saw him come by, and they were waving and everything, and then heard a commotion. Didn't know exactly what had happened and stuff at the time. So, yeah, I had a number of friends whose parents or themselves were downtown seeing the parade, and so. It really struck home. Obviously, I mean, here we, as I say, we sort of lived an idyllic bubble life here in Dallas and certainly in Oak Cliff, and suddenly that bubble was sort of broken, and Dallas, was in the center of world news, and so it really opened. I think it opened our eyes to seeing what was happening in the world, and so it was a turning point, I think, in a lot of people's understanding of history and understanding of Dallas's role in history and things of that nature. So, it was a very traumatic event.
For an Oak Cliff kid like you, the action really centered right there in your community. After the shooting here in the plaza, Tippett is shot in Oak Cliff.
Yes.
The arrest at the Texas Theater. Jack Ruby lives in Oak Cliff. A lot of people lived in the Oak Cliff area that were connected to this. Now
at that time, I lived in South Oak Cliff, but we moved up to 5th Street, which is actually just a few blocks away from where Oswald lived. And obviously, I went to Adamson High School, and just a few blocks away is where Tippett was shot. And obviously, we went to the Texas Theater, so we knew all the areas. We knew everything. I'd ridden my bicycle in all of those areas before, so I was completely familiar with those. So as the story unraveled, it was just like, wow. This happened in our backyard, and so frankly, I remember going to the Texas Theater and finding the seat where Oswald had been sitting, and things of that nature. And so, having been close to sort of world history as it happened here in Dallas and certainly in Oak Cliff, really, I think was one of the initial things that made me interested in history. And as you know, I've written a number of books about history, and I think that was one of the beginnings of being so interested in history and the impact of history, and so from then on in school and stuff, I was always interested in historical topics like that.
J.D. Tippett worked off hours at Austin's Barbecue, kind of like as a security guard. Any chance you might have run into him or any awareness?
I was at Austin's Barbecue. It was a great place to go, and I remember before health regulations or whatever, they had a sawdust floor. I remember the sawdust floor, and I remember there being a policeman there. It could have been Tippett. I never met him personally, but yeah, they were embedded in Oak Cliff for sure.
How soon did you become aware of the fact that Dallas really had a black eye because of the Kennedy assassination?
Fairly soon. I remember hearing how Dallas was called the City of Hate at that time, and I remember how that really hit me. City of Hate. I always thought of Dallas as being, just a great place to live and stuff. And so I was a little bit appalled. I was a little bit maybe ashamed. I was a little bit mad that Dallas would have that reputation. But yeah, I remember that progressing and I think it's certainly persisted. I think for many years, and maybe even today a little bit too, that Dallas still has a little bit of that stigma.
Did you and your family come down to the site early on?
I mean, not immediately, but certainly within. I mean, we did come downtown occasionally, and so again, I took the bus a lot of places back then. So I remember taking the bus down and looking, at the building. Oh, there's the 6th floor, and we looked along the pathway and stuff. I don't remember if the X was there at that time, but we looked and said, oh yeah, that's where it happened, and things like that. So it may have been within a year or two, maybe months, but maybe within a year or two, we came and everybody came and was at that spot near Dealey Plaza.
In the years that followed, did you have an interest in the assassination? Did you look at books, magazines, documentaries, things like that?
Yes, a little. I mean, I wasn't obsessed with it, but I did keep track of it. In fact, when there was a book that came out, the first book about the assassination, written by, what was it called?
You're probably thinking about Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane.
No, there was another one. But I remember going to El Centro and buying. I still have it. First, I thought that was so cool. Oh, well, not cool, but that they were having a big deal at about this book coming out. And I remember I went to El Centro bookstore and bought a copy of it, which I still have. Was it not Michener? I wish I could. It'll come to me as soon as this is over.
Death of the President.
Death of the President. That's Manchester. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, and I still have that copy. So yeah, I mean, I was following it, and like other people, and we saved newspapers, and I think we still have the new. There's probably a million of them out there, but we still have the newspaper that announced the assassination. So yeah, we kept track of those kinds of things as it progressed. Yeah.
How do you feel today about Oswald or a conspiracy?
Well, I personally think that Oswald acted alone. I mean, that's my opinion. It's interesting. I worked at UT Southwestern for many years, and I knew by acquaintance, not close or anything, but I knew by acquaintance several of the doctors that had been in the room where Kennedy, the emergency room, and obviously there's even well, Parkland is closed now, but at the time you could actually go over there and visit the area, and so we did that. So even the doctors there were somewhat, I think, sometimes changed their mind as to whether there was a conspiracy or more than one gun or one bullet. I think that was off and on. So to have a doctor who was at the scene question whether it made me at least say, well, maybe somebody has some validity to this, but I still think it was probably solely Oswald.
Beginning in the early 70s, there was a lot of controversy about this building that we're in today, whether the Texas School Book Depository should be torn down.
Right.
Do you remember that?
I remember it. I remember the Hertz sign. Was it a Hertz sign on the very top? Yeah, I remember this building. Obviously, but once it became a famous building, we paid attention to it, so I remember that. And I remember the beginnings of the 6th floor museum when it first opened. We came down here when it first opened and things like that. I don't exactly remember that they had threatened to tear the building down, but I do remember, talk about the building and what to do with it and all this sort of stuff.
Tell me a little bit about your career and how you evolved into being an author.
Well, I think it started in high school. I had great English teachers in high school. If anybody knows Adamson at that era, there was a Mrs. Janes and a Mrs. Etheridge, and they also taught at SMU. So they were very, very good. And so, even though I made sometimes A's and B's in their class, I think I was enamored by writing at that time and began to write mostly poems and stuff, how a high school kid would do. And then when I went to after I graduated, I didn't do a lot during undergraduate, when I was in graduate school, I was away at Emory University in Georgia, and of course you have breaks and you have summer thing, and so I started, and my wife taught second grade, so we had stacks and stacks of children's books. So I read through all those children's books and stuff, and so maybe I could write one. So actually, first I started writing articles because I was really getting into computing there at the school, and so I wrote articles about the basic language and early microcomputers and things like that, and was published in some fairly decent magazines back then. But I also enjoyed the children's books, so I began writing those and sending things off, and actually got one accepted. And so my first book was actually a children's book published in 1980 by Morrow Press. But at the same time, I was writing a computer book. So the next book I wrote was actually a computer book, how to write the basic language computer book. So that started me. That got it all started. And once I did one computer book, I became interested in that. And there was a company, Prentice Hall, a subsidiary named QUE, that published how-to books, how to do Norton Utilities, how to do Windows, how to do DOS and stuff like that. And I got into their rotation and wrote, almost a dozen books for them about Norton Utilities and other kinds of things. So that got me more and more interested in writing. But again, I wasn't writing anything about history, which is what I enjoyed doing. And so we had talked about a book from our Arcadia Press. So at one time, when I became interested in Oak Cliff's history, I approached them with an idea to do an Oak Cliff book, which they accepted. And so I, along with a couple of co-authors, wrote a book called Images of Oak Cliff, Images of America, Oak Cliff. Oh, sorry about that. Images of America, Oak Cliff. And that was a fun book to write. We followed it up with another book called Legendary Locals from Oak Cliff. And at the same time I was writing, I was in Texas history. So I began writing, just collecting stories about Texas history. And that ended up being a book called Texas Ingenuity, which is a book of sort of a compilation of things that were invented in Texas, or people who became famous from Texas, like how did 7-Eleven get started, Neiman Marcus, the first Hilton Hotel was down here in downtown Dallas. The first hotel named Hilton was in downtown Dallas, even though it got started in West Texas. And the Dr. Pepper, all those kinds of things. So I think all of those are interesting stories, particularly for Texans. So it's a compilation of those kinds of stories, and that actually was done by History Press. Then I worked with a friend of mine who I grew up here with in Oak Cliff, who became head of the history department at Sam Houston State. And I worked with him to write a book that was, he taught American history, and so I worked with him and helped write a single volume history of the United States, which was a lot of fun. So gradually I got into writing more and more books about history, which turned into history books or stories about biographies, which led to the book about JFK.
Right. You also wrote a song about big tech.
I did. So that's an interesting story, because back when I lived in Georgia, I actually started writing. Besides writing picture books and other books, I played guitar, so I toyed at writing stories. And I don't know where the idea came from, but I wrote a story. I envisioned, actually it was a story first, the story of where did big techs come from, and I envisioned him. So it's a little bit of a weird story, but there was a baby born at the Alamo during the siege, and nothing is really known about that baby. So my story was that baby was born, and the people call him Tex, and he grew up, became 8 six cartons of eggs a day and a pound of beef and all this sort of stuff. And he grew up taller and taller and taller, and he became Big Tex. And he had all sorts of adventures in Texas, in the oil fields and in West Texas and stuff like that. And then obviously became the icon at the State Fair. So it started out as a story, and then I took this story and turned it into a song called "The Legend of Big Tex," which I was very, very lucky to work with one of the members of the Light Crust Doughboys, who helped produce that song. And my names are going to escape me, but I think it was Milo Deering who actually recorded the song and did the instrumentals for it. And it's been on now on YouTube for a number of years. I was just looking. I haven't been gotten rich off of it, but it has had 1,000 or more downloads, and it's had 70,000 or more views on YouTube. So it's been a fun thing to have that song out there. So look it up, "The Legend of Big Tex."
Absolutely. Where did the idea for rescuing JFK come from?
Well, so I have a friend who actually lives in the Solomon Islands, and her husband are work for translators, and who translate a lot of things, the Bible plus a lot of other things. But their mission is in literacy, and so they worked with the education department in the government to help provide literacy kinds of things for children, because obviously one of the things translators want to do is not just translate things, but also help the populace be able to read stuff. So they've for 20 or 30 years they've worked with the education department there, and I mean she was aware that one of the so the Solomon Islands, if you ask what are they known for, they're known as the place where JFK was rescued, and so it's really quite a bit of pride for that country. And also one of the biggest battles at Guadalcanal was fought, that is, in the Solomon Islands. And so that's where, so anyways, there was a little bit of an effort to start a JFK museum in the Solomon Islands, which they didn't have. So all of this began to rattle in her brain, and she knew that I'd written children's books and stuff. So she said, "Hey, Alan, the story about JFK's rescue, of course, is that there's a movie about it, there's some books about it, but it's never been told from the Solomon Islands perspective. And it would be so nice for children here to be able to read the story that features how the Solomon Island people helped JFK. If you read the other stories, they mention Biyuku and Aaron and how they helped rescue JFK, but it's just sort of a mention, kind of thing. It's never really gone into depth. And so I began to do some research for it. Fortunately, some anthropologists or I don't know who they were, but anyway, they did oral history, sort of like this, and they interviewed the people, the rescuers and peripheral people who were involved in the rescue, and those were written down in a journal. It's a very obscure journal. We had a hard time getting a copy of it. In fact, we contacted the JFK Museum in Boston, and they had never even heard of it. So we were able to find some really good primary material, and also we were able to I was able to contact the son-in-law of one of the rescuers and get some information from him and some photographs and stuff. And so there were still some people on the islands who knew of the rescue and how it unfolded. So anyway, we were able to sort of starting to piece together. Now, the next very important part is my friend in the Solomons, Martha Motzke, introduced me to a historian in the Solomons, Annie Kwai. And Annie is working on her PhD in history, and her main focus is on Solomon Island history during World War II. So she was perfect. She had published books about the Solomon Islands in World War II, and particularly there was a group called the Coast Watchers and the Coast Watcher Scouts. The Coast Watchers was actually an organization started by the Royal Australian Navy to sort of protect to keep watch on the islands. Now this started in I believe the 1920s, and what it was is usually Westerners, but would set up radio contact information all over these islands, and then natives were recruited as scouts, and they were hired and trained, and the scouts would basically do the dirty work. They were the ones who went out into the waters and the peripheral areas and stuff like that to sort of see what was going on. Now, of course, a lot was going on until the early 1940s, when the Japanese began making an incursion in there, and then they became extremely important because they could get into the nooks and crannies of the islands. And I mean, there's 1,000 islands in Solomon Islands, so there's a lot of territory to cover. So the scouts, very brave, about 500 of them, typically young, 19 to 25-year-old, or maybe even a little bit younger than that. And they were in their own canoes that they created themselves, and anyway, they would paddle from island to island, watching to see what things were going on, and so they were able to then bring that information back to the Coast Watchers, who would then radio that information back to the naval bases or the army bases or whatever, to let them know the movements of the Japanese army. Plus, they were also very instrumental in rescuing pilots, particularly. That's really where they began to become extremely helpful and important. Is there were quite a few pilots that would go down behind enemy territory, and the scouts knew enough information to how to get to them and rescue them. So quite a few American soldiers, American pilots, were rescued in that way. So they were a very important thing. Anyway, so the Solomon Islands, that is a big deal for them, and there is a big statue in the Capitol of Honoraria, and probably at least every 5 years they have a big ceremony. And this past August 2022, was the 80th anniversary of Guadalcanal. And so just recently then there was a big ceremony where a lot of the dignitaries from Australia, from the U.S. and from the Solomon Islands gathered, and there was a big ceremony there. And the book then was presented, the Rescuing JFK book was presented to Caroline Kennedy, who was one of the speakers. So she was there, and an Australian dignitary presented her with a copy of the book, and we were very happy that she actually read through it and said that she really enjoyed it, really liked it. So we were very pleased with that. So anyway, so the 80th anniversary of the actual saving of JFK is next year. So we're looking forward to the 80th anniversary of that coming up.
Extraordinary that an Oak Cliff boy writes a book that is given to the president's daughter in the Solomon Islands.
Yeah.
What an extraordinary story that is. Let me pause for just a second and start a new track. Tell me a little bit about the illustrations.
So the illustrations are by an artist by the name of Evelyn Morgan. She's actually a student at UTA, and this, I believe, is her first book that she's illustrated. She's a very, very talented artist, and the interesting thing, not only was I depending upon Annie to get all of the information right. I mean, the whole purpose of the book was to write it from the Solomon Islands perspective, to write it in a way that honors their culture, that is completely in their point of view. And you'll see in the book there's some little snippets of language that is in their language. You know, it will say someone will say something in English, and the book also has it written in Rovenia, which is a language they would be speaking over there, or Pidgin. And of course, Annie was instrumental in doing that, and very, very meticulous in making sure. You know, that word is not. You know, they wouldn't use the word ocean; they would only use the word sea. So, you know, when we couldn't talk about ocean, we had to talk about sea. So, you know, no, that's not the name of the bird. You know, so all of these things we really worked with in the text of the book to get it right, and it's the same way with Evelyn working with Annie and some other people from the Solomons. Is we had a general idea. She did a general sketch out of, you know, this is what the scenes would look like, and so those went to to Annie and the other folks in the Solomons, and they'd say, yeah, that looks all right, but no, that bird wouldn't be there. No, that frond wouldn't. Since it's during the summer, it wouldn't look like this. It would look like this. You know, so they're very, very meticulous again to make sure that when a Solomon Islander reads this book, they'll see that all of the illustrations are correct in terms of their culture and what they would expect. So Evelyn really worked very hard in getting those as they were. I mean, even in the back of the book, there's a picture of a canoe, and the words in English and Ravini, I believe, and that canoe took a long time because they kept on saying, no, I think it's too wide. No, I think they would have done this. No, I think, you know, so there was a lot of back and forth in terms of getting things just right. And so I really have to praise Evelyn for her not only for her artistic talent, but also in the way that she was able to communicate with Annie, and also Martha. Martha, having lived in the Solomons and knowing so many people in the Solomons, would show people the pictures. And so Martha over there was I mean, if you could call her anything, she was the manager or producer of this book. She was the fire behind the book to make sure, you know, everything was right, and then it got done in a way that looked great. And there was another person actually who worked with the book, a book designer, Cindy Rodella Purdy, which a lot of people don't think about the fact you need a designer, but a designer puts the book together in a way that is pleasing. I mean, if you look at the book, the little numbers at the bottom of the book, the little illustrations on the side, the way the illustrations line out, like things I don't know, like, you know, when you're reading a book, an illustration should sort of go from the left to the right, because that's the way that a person is reading. So you want the illustration to help forward the story, you know. And so she worked with Evelyn in that. So Cindy was also a great help in making the book, I think, look fantastic.
In writing for children, what's the challenge in trying to convey detailed, complex historical information, but do it in a way that is both understandable but also meaningful and relevant?
Well, that's a very good question, and a very important thing to consider. Within this book and some other things that I've written, you know, you have to keep several things in mind. One is the wording. Obviously, you can't be too complex in the wording or too complex in the sentence. And you want to make a story as readable as possible. So there are a number of things that you want to think about. But in many ways, particularly in a short piece, which is a picture book, or this would be a chapter book, every sentence really is very important. Unlike a novel, sometimes in a novel you can get by with sort of going here and there, but in a short piece, every sentence has to count. And every sentence has to sound good, be in a way that is you can read out loud, because a lot of these books, like this book, will be read out loud to children by a teacher or a parent or someone like that. And so you have to read a lot of this stuff out loud and make sure you know, you don't have words that go hard together. And sometimes you can be very particular. Sometimes you want a word that has a K in it, for instance, or an R in it, because it expresses, you know, K is a hard sound. If you're trying to get across something like that, or an ooh or an o sound if something is more, calm or something like that. So there's a lot of stuff to do with the wording. You don't want sentences that are too complex. You want sentences that go back and forth from very short, to not very long, but you don't want to be boring, and you want to have a story that that can be remembered. I mean, all of us, Disney and other places like that, if you really look at their stories, there's a typical way that you tell a story. You have an incident that happens, and in this case, the Solomon Island rescuers were told there was an accident or something that happened with one of the PT boats. Keep watch for it. Well, what had happened is a destroyer rammed into the PTO 109, split it in half, and so the sailors out there, Kennedy and the rest of the sailors, were out there in the middle of the bay, really, with no one to rescue them. And so that was what we called an inciting incident. It was something important that happened. And then you typically have tries to solve the problem. Well, this story just fit into that because, there was time and time again where Kennedy and the sailors had a hard time trying to figure out what to do. They finally swam to an island which was 3 miles away. Which one of the more dramatic events is when Kennedy, one of the sailors couldn't hardly move at all, was burned, and so Kennedy put a strap in his teeth that was attached to the sailor and swam him the 3 miles to the island. So there's some very dramatic events. So you try to place the dramatic events in such a way that they have a building kind of effect. Are they going to be saved? This is bad is happening. Are they going to be saved? And finally, at some sort of climax, you see that the two come together, and you see that it's possible to be saved. Except in this case, the rescuers found them, but they were just in a canoe. They couldn't save them, and so now you had this other dramatic event that happened, and that is how do we let the Navy base know that they're there, which is 70 miles away. And so there had to be now another really episode of them going across the bay 70 miles in their paddle boat. And then once they get there, they weren't believed. Nobody had ever heard of Kennedy. This was an Army base or a Marine base, so nobody had ever heard of Kennedy. They thought they were trying to lure them into a trap with the Japanese. And so, and although the radio operators had been notified, the radios were broken. And so it's like one of those things in history we hear about where everything went wrong. But then all of a sudden they get the radio confirming, and they find out, yes, this is a true story, and then the rescue happened. So it is a very interesting, I think, and dramatic story. And so you try to piece it together in such a way that you try to build a drama, and you try to make it so that the reader cares about what's going on, obviously wants the rescue to happen, and then you have the satisfaction of the rescue happening, and then there's a little bit of a epilogue there about what happened to Kennedy after that.
Did you find your own opinion of Kennedy heightened after reading about his early life?
Well, I think anybody, well, not anybody, but I had read certainly a lot about Kennedy, so I knew a lot about his life and everything. I didn't know the details of this. I think one of the things you can get out of it is he was a leader. At that time, he was only in his early 20s, and the things that he did during that time were above and beyond what I think a normal person would do. Not only did he drag the guy to the island to save him, but then that same day he swam another couple of miles out into the ocean to try to wave down any ship that might come by, and they did that repeatedly. To where, I think they think that he lost 30 or 40 pounds during this whole episode. He was just skin and bones by the time they finally rescued him. But he kept going, and the unfortunate thing is, even though several PT boats witnessed his boat exploding, they all came to the conclusion no one could have survived that, and so there was no rescue being made, and so he didn't know it, but it was fruitless for him to go out there because there was nobody to look for him. If he found anybody, it was probably going to be a Japanese boat. So it was just so that's why it was so important that the scouts found him, because nobody else would have.
I know the book just recently came out, but can you give me a sense of the response you've gotten so far?
We've gotten some very good response. Obviously, Carolyn Kennedy getting a copy of it and liking it. We've had some interest again in the Solomon Islands with the education department there. Hopefully, we're going to. There's some indication we might be able to place one in every school, and maybe even like for fourth, fifth graders, whatever. Our hope is to give a copy to every kid. Australia is very interested in it, and there's some people in there. There's some of the leaders within Solomon Islands. One is Sir Bruce, who has taken a big role in helping to get it distributed there. But we're still in the early stages. We've gotten places like the Sixth Floor Museum and some other places around the United States show some interest in it, and it's only been out less than a month. So, but we're seeing some sales. We don't actually, we sort of see some numbers. We don't even actually know who's buying it yet, but we're hoping that particularly museums, where people like the JFK Museum, some bookstores around, like in Boston, and there's the Museum of World War II, I believe is the name of it, in New Orleans. The Pearl Harbor bookstore, those kinds of things that deal with either World War II or American history or things like that, I think are going to be a primary place that the book is going to be seen. But we're hoping it'll also make it to just general bookstores.
Well, Kennedy is certainly a figure that 60 years on remains fascinating to the American public, and young people seem captivated by different aspects of his life, whether it be the assassination or the PT-109 incident. So excellent. I enjoyed the book a great deal, and I appreciate the perspective from the Solomon Islands, because I've read so much about that incident that it was interesting to take a step back and look at it from an entirely different point of view.
You'd mentioned about writing books for children, and you're always a little bit concerned, is this book going to speak to children, particularly American children who don't know anything about it? So it's been interesting, because we sent copies of this to a number of readers and things like that. And it's interesting that, and we were hoping to hear their perspective, but what we heard back from them is, oh, my son, who's 8 years old, picked it up, read through it, and now he wants to take it to school and show the librarian, and wants me to buy a copy of it for so and so and so. And then another one, a young girl about 8, read it again, then took it to her dad and said, oh, this is a great book, I want to show it to my friend. So we've been very pleased that even though we didn't ask for it, we've gotten feedback from kids anywhere from 7 or 8 years old up to 12 who read through the book and really liked it, and are excited enough that they want to show it to their friends or tell other people about the story. So we were very pleased about that. That is golden for us. That's what we wanted to happen.
Do you think you might write another book about Kennedy, another aspect of his life?
Well, you never know. I mean, it's just like this book came out of nowhere, really. And so as a writer, sometimes you don't know what's flying around in the ether. People talk, there's ideas up there, and sometimes they descend on you, or opportunities, and then you have to choose whether to do something about it. So who knows? I mean, that's a very interesting life, very interesting story. As you say, JFK has always been a very interesting topic, a very persuasive kind of book to write forever. So there's quite a number out there. We're hoping that the name and the story will help people take a look at it and learn to like it.
Excellent. Is there anything that we haven't talked about, any other stories from your childhood or stories about the book you want to share?
Let me think. We talked about, the only other thing I can say is that I'm in a community of writers here in Dallas. Actually, I will mention one group called the SCBWI, which is, if I can get this right, the Society of Children's Book Authors and Illustrators, which is it's a international group of children's book authors. And within every community, there are groups. There's a North Texas group, and within the North Texas group, there are critique groups. And so I'm a member of several of those. And so as you're writing a book like this, you don't want to just write it yourself and then send it out. It's so important to get feedback as you're going along. And so I will say that there's a great community of writers, children's book writers here in Dallas, who contributed to this by reading early drafts of it and saying, oh, this doesn't work, or, maybe you ought to try this or something like that. So I think, I often get the question, I think I'll write a children's book. But it's harder than you think, because as I mentioned, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of thought. It's like, in some ways, it's like writing a poem. I mean, it's not a poem, but it's almost like a prose poem, because every line is important. And to get to that stage, it helps to have people who can help you move toward that. So I just want a shout out to all the local writers and critique people who read early versions of it and contributed to the process of getting it to where it is now.
Excellent. And what was the name of the school you were attending in 63?
John Neely Bryan. John Neely Bryan. So it's in South Oak Cliff, right off of Keast.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you again for being part of this. It was a pleasure to meet you, a pleasure to read the book, and I look forward to seeing what else you do in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me here today.